Start by introducing myself. Good evening. My name is Emily Bagwell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the resource manager for Reconciling Ministries Network. And one of the joys of my job is to help put together these virtual porch opportunities for us to gather in this virtual way as community and to learn together, to support one another, to be reminded that we are not alone, that there are many people around us on this journey. And we seek to bring topics to you, learning opportunities where we can dive into something together and listen with an open heart and with an open mind. And I'm so grateful for tonight's facilitator and our guest this evening. She is very familiar to the Reconciling movement, and she is coming to share a piece of her heart and her home and her work with us, and to share one of her newest gifts to the community, which is a book, which you will hear more about. And so I'm thrilled to welcome Rachel Cornwell, pastor, author, mom, advocate, so many more things to our virtual space this evening. She's going to be talking about the beauty of gender diversity. And I hope that you come this evening with an open heart and open mind and your ears ready just to listen and lean into her story and what she will share with us this evening. Just as a reminder, for those who are here with us in person in this hour, we would love to engage with you in this time. Rachel is graciously willing to answer questions and just hear from you what questions and curiosities, clarifications that would be helpful to you and where you are. So we invite you to utilize the chat function so that you can just let us know as things come to your mind. You don't have to hold on to those. If you have a question that you're not sure that you want to ask out loud or write in the chat, but you're curious about, we want to give you permission that it is a safe space to ask that. And you may choose to do that by sending me a private message. And I am happy to discern and help facilitate the asking or phrasing of that question if that is more comfortable to you. So you can do that throughout the time here as we are gathered together. But again, we are just so grateful for our opportunity to connect and to be in community with one another and to learn and support each other. And tonight, I welcome Rachel and turn it over to Rachel to say a little bit more about who she is, what brought her through this work, and then lead us in a wonderful and robust conversation this evening. So thanks for being here, Rachel. Thanks for being a part of this evening with us.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm so happy to be here, and it's wonderful to see old friends and new friends. This is exciting. We had the official book launch for Daring Adventures at Dumbarton United Methodist Church on Sunday, so I'm really excited to get this book out in the world and to share it and to engage in conversation with people about gender diversity and especially how we can support our trans and gender diverse kids. I have some slides that I'm going to share with you. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes and then open it up for some conversation. So let me just make sure that can you all see that? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Okay, good. So actually, yeah, start here. So I'd just love to tell you a little bit about my family. As you can see from this picture, it's a couple of years old, but I'm the mom of 3 kids. My husband, Marcus, and I have a daughter, Nora, who's a senior in high school, a son, Graham, who's a freshman in high school, and our son, Evan, is a 6th grader, and he identifies as a transgender boy. When we had our daughter and then our son, we were so happy to be parents of these wonderful human beings. We did not think that our family was yet complete. And so we had a child in 2011. We thought that this child was a girl, and it turns out that he's a boy. Even as a baby, Evan was our most daring child. He was the only one that we had to, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, that we had to baby proof the house for. He was always getting into stuff and he was very sporty and adventurous, and and just a great kid all around. But he also, from a very young age, expressed himself in a more typically male way. He wanted his hair short. He wanted to wear typical boy clothes. He wanted to do activities that were more what you would associate with a young, with a boy. And we just thought that this was just, who he is. And we didn't think much about it. We don't argue about hair or clothing in our family. If it fits and it's appropriate for the weather, you can wear whatever you want. But when he started to be about 4 or 5, he started saying things that were a little deeper, like, when I grow up, I'm going to be a man. I'm going to marry a woman. I don't want to have children. I want to adopt children, which, is a wonderful thing, but it was not part of our family story. So it was kind of surprising that this was coming out at such a young age. And then he started to say things like, when am I going to get breasts, mommy? Because I don't want them. And when I get breasts, I'm going to cut them off. And this was, he was 4 at this point. So that was a little concerning. And we thought, well, maybe this is something a bit deeper than we initially thought. And I remember one conversation in particular where he had been saying things like this, and I wasn't quite sure what the emotional level was, how he was feeling about all of this. And so I asked him, I said, Evan, at that point, I did not call him Evan, but I said, are you sad that you were born a girl? And he said, yes, mommy, I told God when I was a star in the sky that I was a boy, but God made me a girl. And now I just have to live with it. And I was stunned at how clear and articulate my child was about who he was, about who God made him to be, about this deep, deep sense that he was a boy, and how it was so connected with his relationship with God. He had always been told in church that God made you just as you are, and that God doesn't make mistakes. And I said, I believe that's true, that God made you just as you are, and your body is just one part of who you are. And that there are boys that were born girls and girls that were born boys, and those people are transgender, and maybe that's what you are. And he didn't believe me at first because he didn't know that trans people existed in the world. And I realized that we needed to do more to share with him about the trans experience and the fact that trans people existed. And so that began our journey of kind of showing Evan that this was a possibility that he might step into. For me, this psalm, as I thought back on how I responded to my kid in that moment, nothing had really prepared me for that specific conversation, but there was this psalm means so much to me. The idea that God knows us before we're even born, that God knows our inward parts, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and that trans and gender diverse people are also part of God's beautiful design and beautiful diversity in the world. And that is part of how humanity is fearfully and wonderfully made in our gender diversity. So I believe that was a part of my theological grounding and how I came to understand who my kid was, and that this is part of how God made people and made us to be in relationship with each other. So this is a picture of Evan, oh gosh, there, at age 6, when he went to a camp called Free to Be, which was for gender diverse kids and for young children. And then the counselors were all gender diverse teenagers. And it was one of the first times that Evan had been around other trans young people. And it was just such an affirming, celebratory experience for him. You can see that he's just delighted by that. And then this other picture on the right is him at age 10 when he bridged up to Boy Scouts, or Scouts BSA, as we call it now. And part of the reason why I named my book Daring Adventures is because of another conversation that Evan and I had early on, or that he had with me and his father, when he was a Daisy Scout in kindergarten. And he was complaining about how the Girl Scouts never did anything fun. They always just sat around in a circle and talked about being friends. And his brother, he saw, going off on Cub Scout adventures and getting dirty and playing with knives and building fires. And he said, I don't want to be a Daisy Scout. I want to be a Boy Scout, because Boy Scouts go on daring adventures. And I knew that wasn't entirely true, because we have a daughter who's also in scouting and she did some pretty cool things, but it was another way that I felt like he was telling us who he really was. And he's still in scouting, and he loves it. And it's another place where he is really affirmed as a boy, and in all the things he's passionate about. One of the chapters in my book is entitled "We Are the Lucky Ones." And I wrote that because people would always say to us in a really affirming way, Evan is so lucky to have you as his parents. And I know where that comes from. I know it comes from an awareness that a lot of trans and gender diverse kids don't have that support from their families, and how important it is for these young people to have that affirmation. We know that rejection from family contributes significantly to self-harm, to mental health issues. Kids, in a recent study that was done by the Trevor Project, it showed that youth who are affirmed by their families, their communities, trans and gender diverse youth, have similar rates of depression, anxiety, self-harming behaviors as their peers, as their cisgender peers. But for kids who don't have that, there's a much higher rate of suicidal ideation, other self-harming behaviors. More than a quarter report using drugs, alcohol to cope with transgender related discrimination. And so, it's incredibly important that our kids have this. But I also believe that we're, as parents, as families, as churches that have gender diverse young people in our lives, we're the lucky ones, because we get to learn so much from them, because they are just incredible people. And so I just wanted to kind of reframe that around the blessing that it is to have a transgender child. Because I really believe that he's a gift to me, and that these kids are very special, and we're fortunate to have them in our lives. This is something that a response that was shared with me, and I really loved it, and I wanted to share it here. It can be really shocking for kids, or for parents rather, or caregivers or grandparents, when they learn that their child is exploring their gender. And I think I learned this from Emily Bagwell, actually. When someone comes out to you, it's actually an invitation to come in, right? It's an invitation to be in relationship. It's a real privilege if someone comes out to you and shares part of their the gender identity, their sexual identity. And often our first response is to say, I love you no matter what. Right. And but a more positive framing on that response is to say, the more I learn about you, the more I love you. And this is also really important, I think, for these kids who are coming out younger and younger, and coming out multiple times. Right. So in the book that I wrote, I didn't just write about our family's experience. I interviewed about 20 other families who have kids at different ages and stages and different experiences with their gender journey. And some of them came out very young, like my child. Some of them came out much older, as teenagers or as young adults. And some of them came out initially as lesbian or as gay, and then came out as transgender, and then perhaps came out as non-binary. And so it's an evolution as these kids are learning who they are, and maybe trying on different identities to see what really feels authentic. And so to say to a child, I love you no matter, the more I learn about you, the more I love you and I love you now, and I affirm who you are now, and I affirm who you're becoming, is an invitation to these kids to continue to learn and to grow. Um, Another way that we learned this was that we're very fortunate to have a gender development clinic at the Children's National Medical Center here in Washington, D.C. And so we started going to the gender clinic when Evan was about 7 years old. And he had an intake with a psychologist, and that lasted 2 days. And at some point, the psychologist said to him in front of me, you know, Evan, I affirm that you identify as a boy, and we celebrate that. And we just want you to know that if later, as you grow up, you decide that you want to identify as a girl or as neither boy nor girl, that's okay. And I kind of held my response until my kid was out of the room. And then I said to the therapist, I said, you've got to help me understand, because we worked so hard to affirm him, to go from having what we thought was a girl to celebrating our son. And now you're saying he can change again. And she said, yeah, but he's 7 years old. He's 8 years old. He has a lot of growing and maturing to do. And he's going to continue to learn about himself. And so you as a parent need to learn how to hold this lightly. And I have tried to do that and go with the flow as this journey has unfolded. And thankfully, he continues to be consistent and insistent and persistent about who he is as a boy, but that could change. And so trying to stay open to who he discovers himself to be as he matures. I'm sharing this, maybe you've seen this resource before. This is called The Genderbread Person. And it's a way of illustrating how gender diversity is a multi-layered experience for all of us, right? Gender identity is located in our mind, right? Who we know ourselves to be, or in our heart, in our soul, who we believe we are, who we know ourselves to be on the inside, right? But gender expression is who we show ourselves to be on the outside. And so when a person socially transitions, which is probably one of the more early stages of transition in a transgender experience, they start to wear clothing or makeup or cut their hair in a way that reflects on the outside who they know themselves to be on the inside. But we know that people are unique, and we all have different styles and ways that we want to present ourselves in the world. So gender expression is on a spectrum, just like gender identity is on a spectrum as well. A lot of people get confused about biological sex and gender identity, right? That if someone is biologically male or female, what does that mean in terms of their gender identity? And for the vast majority of us who are cisgender, our biology aligns with who we know ourselves to be on the inside. But if you are transgender, non-binary, there's a tension there, or a disconnect, or there is a difference there between our biological bodies. And sometimes that needs to match for a transgender person. Sometimes there's a desire to match your anatomical body with your gender identity, but not always. And so not all transgender people physically transition. And this is probably the more controversial part of, especially when we're talking about children and youth, their desire to take hormones or have gender affirming surgery so that their bodies they can feel at home in their bodies. And there's a whole chapter on that in my book, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on that right now, but I can answer questions about that. And then sexual orientation is also another spectrum, right? In terms of attraction, who we fall in love with, and that. So all of these things are on spectrums, and they're all different pieces that make up who we understand ourselves to be. And so hopefully this is helpful in kind of understanding all of our identities, right? And the multi-layered aspects of that. Oh yeah, okay. So there are some misconceptions about gender diverse youth out there, and I won't spend a ton of time on these, but we can unpack them more if you'd like. One is that kids can't know who they are when they're so young. And research around child development shows that kids have start to form their gender identity between the ages of 3 and 5. They start to understand an awareness of male and female. And so kids can start to articulate that very young, or they may just start to feel that they are being misgendered, or that they are who they are is not who they were assigned at birth. And they may not be able to articulate that until later, or they may not even acknowledge it to themselves. They may not have the language for it. But a lot of trans and non-binary youth know that about themselves at a very young age. The second is that people tend to think that this is, trans people are everywhere now, and it's just a fad, and it's a popular thing to do. And, the transgender people are only 1% of the US population, or less than 1% of the US population. The greatest number of trans people, however, are between the ages of 13 and 17. So there is a lot more exploration of gender identity in this younger generation. And I think permission to kind of question these gender labels and roles. But that doesn't mean that it's an overwhelming fad or trend. It is still a very hard thing in many ways to come out as a trans person. When I wrote this about 1% in the book, and Evan read it, he said, "Mom, you should have said how many people that is, though, because numerically it's a large number." So he wants you all to know that there are a lot of trans people. But the point I was trying to make is that it is not a fad or a trend. It's still a small number of people. And we need to create space for these kids to explore who they are. And there are ways to do that that are pretty low risk, right? To allow these kids the space to explore who they are. And people immediately think that these kids are doing, making permanent changes to their body, their fertility, and that's just not true. The kids who are doing that, they really need it, and they have to go through a lot to get the gender affirming care that they need. And I speak as someone who grew up in Arkansas, which was one of the first states to outlaw gender affirming care. And now in Texas and in Alabama and in Utah, it's illegal, and these parents are being persecuted for seeking gender affirming care for their kids. So it's really, in some places, it's really a crisis. Number 3 is related to that. Like, kids are being pressured or groomed into being trans. And I would just say, no one can make you transgender. And no one can make you not transgender, right? If these kids are who they are, then that is who they are. And we can't change that. We can only change ourselves and our perspective. And the last one is, what if they change their mind? There's all this fear about detransitioning, and it's a very, very small number. Of course, the science on this and the research on this is continuing to unfold, but tracking people who have transitioned, it's a very small number of people who detransition, who regret transitioning and decide later that it was a mistake. And so again, helping kids to work through their sense of identity, affirming that, helping them, giving them the space to explore, and guiding them towards the things that will help them feel safe, affirmed, and comfortable in their own bodies is really what the goal is, in my mind. I write in the book too about having communities of support, and how churches, as well as family, as well as school, as well as gender affirming healthcare, mental health care, and public spaces that affirm gender diversity are all part of this community of support that we're trying to create. And so I just want to really say that all of these things are important. And so as we advocate and as we look at all these issues, we're fighting on multiple fronts, or we're trying to work on in a myriad of spaces for a gender affirming space for these kids. And so it's something to just be aware of if you are wanting to be an ally, if you're part of a church that wants to support these kids. There's a lot of work to be done in all of these spaces to create circles of support. And I have some suggestions in the book about ways that churches can be supportive of trans and non-binary and gender diverse kids by working to create safe communities. I know that I think you're all part of Reconciling Churches. So you've taken a great first step there. But if you want to specifically focus on these gender diverse kids, providing pastoral care to them and to their families is a huge part of that. I interviewed one family who talked about how affirming their church was. They said when their kid came out, she was the first trans person to come out in their church. And they said, so their pastor said, just tell us what we need to do, which was a far better response than could have been. But I think we can do better, right? Instead of putting the onus on these parents who are figuring stuff out, or these families that are figuring stuff out along with their kids, by doing our own work to figure out what are the resources in our community, where are the support groups, can we create a support group, what resources are available so that we know something about this experience and can come alongside them as we would with anybody else experiencing a need for pastoral care. Including transgender visibility in your worship is also a way of celebrating and creating safe and affirming space, and then advocating for transgender rights in your community, in your state, at your school board meetings, figuring out what are the issues and how can you use the moral voice of your congregation to advocate for transgender rights out in the broader world are all ways that you can help to support these young people. So I will pause there and open it up for questions. And I talked longer than I intended to, so I apologize.
No, that was wonderful, Rachel. Thank you so much for sharing. And we do have some initial questions in the chat, and I'll help communicate some of those. But there are others of you who may have questions that you've been holding on to. And again, you can feel free to put those now in the chat as we engage a little bit further with Rachel. So one of the questions, just going back a couple of slides that wanted to ask is, you mentioned there are some low risk ways to help kids explore who they are. Can you give us an example of a couple of what that might have either been for your family or just things that you have found in research that kind of indicate towards a lower risk as we support kids exploring?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I look at transitioning when somebody transitions from the gender they were assigned at birth to a different gender. There's some stages along the way, right? And the first tends to be social transition, what we call social transition. Changing name, changing pronouns, changing dress or expression. And I feel like those are ways that we can allow kids to explore a different identity. And we don't have to change, you don't have to legally change a person's name. You can use the name that they prefer, the pronouns that they prefer. Again, I mean, I don't fight about hair or clothes, so none of that is permanent to me. I mean, if you want to cut your hair, you can grow it back. If you want to wear makeup, then you can do that. If you want to go out, and a lot of parents talk about when their kids first come out to them, taking them shopping to buy clothes that feel more affirming, and how important that is, right? Or I've talked about churches that have clothing closets for trans and gender diverse youth, so that those youth can come and try on clothes that are more just trying on clothes to see if it fits with who they know themselves to be. In our school system, and I know this is probably not true everywhere, but when my kid changed his name and pronouns in first grade, we were able to first change his name and pronouns in the classroom with his teacher. And then later, as he continued to affirm that this was who he was and wanted to continue using this name and pronouns, we were able to change it in the school database without changing it legally. But just a letter from his therapist and a letter from his parents saying, this is, Evan is a boy, and his name is Evan. And then that changed it. So now his report card that comes home says Evan, the, school roster says Evan, the app that we have on our phone. And before it was, he was using one name in his classroom, but other things were not aligned. And so he kept being outed and being reminded that this wasn't, he wasn't affirmed everywhere. And so I think those are things that you can do. Now you can change your gender marker on your passport without having your birth certificate changed. And it's easy to do. The State Department will let you just submit a passport change form and say, I identify as male, female, or non-binary. And those things are just, you can change it back, right? And I think those are the kinds of low risk things. But also puberty blockers are, there's concern about them because they haven't been widely studied. But the advice that we've gotten from our doctor is that these are fully reversible. And so when our child goes off of them, he can either start taking cross hormones to go through male puberty and the secondary sex characteristics of male puberty, or just go off of them entirely and go through female puberty. So it buys us some time for him to continue to figure out who he is, because he's only 11, right? But he was very, very scared of getting his period. I mean, not just like, it's a scary thing for girls too, but even more triggering for him.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I want to circle back to another question. And I want to remind you that if you want to speak, not necessarily from your family experience, but just generically, or what you've learned along the way, whatever feels most comfortable to you. But one of the issues that comes up often when we talk about trans and non-binary individuals is public restroom use and how that goes for people, how that is accommodating or not. And so the curiosity question of how does someone deal with that in a more diverse population, and just wondering if you had any reflections about, I'll just add in there any like tips or kind of ways of viewing that and understanding that as our larger society is very tied in with bathroom concerns. Are there something you would want to share around that?
This question came up at church on Sunday too. And I said, I have a t-shirt that says you can pee next to me. This is a made up issue. Okay. And it really is only about transgender women. So my son had an issue when he started identifying or expressing himself in more as a boy, and went into the girls' bathroom at school and had a girl come up to him and say, "You can't be in here." And it was very confusing because he was a first grader and he was in the midst of this transition. And so then he started using the nurse's bathroom at school for a while. But, I worked with a church in Baltimore that did a renovation of their social hall, and they made one bathroom instead of two bathrooms that one was male, one was female. They just created one bathroom. and every stall had a door that went from floor to ceiling, and then there was a central hand washing station. And if we can do that in church, right, we can do, like, people just go in, they do their business, they come out, they wash their hands. It's not a big deal. And I just think that this is a made up issue that it's used to demonize trans people, to say that they're scary and they're other and they're somehow threatening. And yeah, that's all I would say about that.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that response. I think sometimes just being reminded of the ways in which we handle it is not often the healthiest in our society, and there are ways that we can support by, you know, even using some of the language you just offered to us as a way to have conversation with one another. It can be an important thing. So another question we have is, what resources would you recommend for an older child? In this case, someone offers a 19-year-old, but just a teenager maybe, or young adult, to explore their gender expression. And I would add to it their whatever gender diversity they may find themselves. Because as you've shared with your family, it was a younger articulation, identifying early, but we know that that is not the case for everybody. So someone who maybe has lived in with a certain kind of placement in their social circles and in schools for a longer period, and then begins to transition a little bit longer or a little bit later. So if you could just kind of speak to that, both on gender expression and include gender identity for any older children that might be transitioning or identifying in some different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I have a page of recommended resources. I recommend the Gender Revolution, which is a National Geographic documentary film, to almost everybody as a starting place to learn more about gender diversity, because it really talks about transgender, non-binary, intersex, and all kinds of different gender expressions, and is just really very accessible. There's a book edited by Lee Finke called Queerfully and Wonderfully Made, a guide for LGBTQ Christians and Christian teens. So for some older kids. And Justin Tanis has written a book called Transgendered Theology, Ministry, and Communities of Faith. And one of the earlier books on transgender theology is Austin Hartkey's book, Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. So those are really some Christian-specific resources. And I know that Reconciling Ministry has some as well. The Human Rights Campaign has some good resources on their website about transgender issues and identity and advocacy. And I know that I think that Jen Birch put another resource in the chat. So
yeah, the trans equality has a good, that's
trans equality is a good one.
And just for
learned
everybody on the call,
Yeah.
I'm going to be getting these resources from Rachel and sharing them. So you don't have to worry about making all the notes. That will be shared alongside this recording for people to access later. So, but yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And then kind of in the same maybe age range as churches are thinking about making inclusive and supportive spaces for both children and youth and their families, the question is coming up of what would signal a safe space for families with gender diverse kids. Can you think of some ways that churches could do that in a good way?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, be sure that your reconciling statement includes gender diversity, and maybe your youth group wants to write their own reconciling statement or welcoming statement. If you have a space that's dedicated for youth, including some trans or pride kind of symbols there would be good. I think I also really encourage churches to kind of look just at the language on their website and their policies. And, when we just redid our safe sanctuary policy, or we're in the process of it. And ours was from 2010. And I mean, Dumbarton's been a reconciling church for almost 36 years, but we had language about boys and girls not sleeping in the same room. And we had to revisit that and talk about, that we would have conversations with our youth about where they felt comfortable sleeping. We're still clear that adults and children are not sharing spaces together, but having conversations with youth and their parents about what will make them feel safe, because we have 2 non-binary youth in our youth group. And just like those kinds of things will signal to kids and their families that this is a church that's trying to understand me, trying to keep me safe.
Thank you. Yeah, that goes a long way. And another one I'll add in that is I know to be powerful is just using pronouns regularly and not assuming someone's that signals that talking about a signal that one signals to that I want to know who you are and you tell me who you are. So I think that's an easy one that greeters can do as families are coming in the door. So that's one that I think is always important to remember. And
or
then
if you have signage to direct people to your gender neutral bathroom, if you have one of those. And then Cody Sanders wrote a book called Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQ Youth, which is also really good and really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks for that resource. Another question, Rachel, that there are many churches that are in states that are moving towards legislation that is very prohibited for transgender people and care, et cetera, that we've talked about. Are there other materials or resources that you think would be good things to keep on hand for people to get that may not be in public spaces, like where there are book bans or just restrictions on things? Do you think that is, I mean, to me, that'd be another potential way of signaling openness for your community. But do you have a response or some ideas around that?
Yeah, I think you could have a lending library. You could have, you could have an educational forum on some of these issues. You could also figure out who in your community are the gender affirming providers, right? Therapists, medical providers, or if there's medical providers out of state that you could direct people to. Maybe you need to come up with a little, like they're doing for abortion funds, right? Maybe a travel fund for people to come to see people out of state. I'm just riffing here, but I think also some of these bills are being challenged in court. And as you feel comfortable writing letters to the editor, or writing letters to your representatives about, as a person of faith, and why you believe that kids need to have access to this kind of care. Just continuing to reframe the narrative in terms of these kids' right and these parents' right to provide gender affirming, life-saving care to these kids is really important. And trans equality has already been mentioned, but the ACLU also are good places to kind of track this legislation and knowing where it's going and how it's impacting people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I know it's that many of our folks are living in areas where they're having to be aware and to work. I was just on the Parents Reconciling board meeting last week and reminded that, we have legislation in Tennessee and Nebraska that is, right now being what is being discussed. So it's important for us to be advocates in that way. Thank you. Another question.
And the book banning is another thing. And so if you haven't read Genderqueer, you should read it. It's a beautiful memoir, and I learned a lot from it. And that's the book that is, people are shutting down libraries about. And I know somebody who is going around West Virginia putting them into little free libraries. So that's another subversive thing you could do.
Creative, we'll call it creative way. Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, I wonder if you'd be willing to think and share with us a little bit just about, you already acknowledged in the beginning that you have the perspective of we're the lucky ones as parents of gender diverse kids. And we know that there are so many kids who are in non-affirming spaces, either their parents or family members or just their environment, their context is not affirming. Could you say or share a little bit just from your own insight and research and pastor hat of how would you, I guess, encourage families or family members who may be watching this happen even within their own families where there's not affirmation happening, and also like ways to kind of back to that letting kids explore a little bit, but kind of being sticklers about other pieces like that control that sometimes we want to have as parents of like, I'll let you do this, but I won't let you do this. Could you just kind of speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason why I wrote this book as a parent for other parents was because, I mean, I believe we have such an important role to play. And I'm hoping that we, parents who are affirming of our kids, can encourage other parents. There's a lot of fear and anxiety, right? There's loss and grief to lose the identity of a child that you thought you knew. There's a loss of a sense of power and control of like, we have such an important role of forming our kids and shaping them into the kind of human being that we believe they should be in the world, and that you still can do that, right? But there's also this acknowledgement of they come to us, God made them, and God made them in such a way that there's only so much about our kids that's within our control to change or to shape. And so just helping parents, I think, to know that the most important thing is that your kid is healthy and they thrive, and that we want these kids to live. We want these kids to, and it can be really hard. I try to empathize with these parents. It was hard for me, right? And I wanted to be affirming from the very beginning, but just no, was I making the right choices? Was I doing the right things? Was I connecting him with the right resources? Were we pushing too hard or not enough? So I think I tell parents in the book a lot, like, find your own support system, find your own support network, your own therapist, your own clergy person, your own friend group to talk to about these things, because we have our own issues that we have to work through. And I would say, don't discount the importance of one affirming person in a child's life. So even if you have a kid in your church and their parents are not affirming yet, right? They still could be, but you can be an affirming person in that kid's life, and that can make a huge difference. So I just, I empathize with the parents, give them the support they need, encourage them to continue to love their kid, and to recognize that there's so much about their kid that doesn't change just because their gender changes, right? I mean, gender is only one part of who we are, and there's so many things about your kid, their sense of humor, the activities they like to do, that doesn't change. And so affirming that too, encouraging parents to look at the whole person is also, I don't know, part of what I would offer.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to you because I want to give you the opportunity to share with us a little bit more from your book. We're very excited for you and the gift that it is to just the reconciling community, but way beyond that as well. Just as we seek to learn and to become more equipped with ways in which we can really celebrate our gender diverse kids and young adults and adults in our lives. And so thank you for offering this book out into the world, your voice in it. And we'd love to hear just a little bit from it as we kind of begin to draw our evening to a close.
Yeah. And Emily, would you mind putting the link in the chat to buy the book? Do you have that on hand, or should I?
I will get that. You want me to do the Amazon one?
No, if you have the Acta publication one, you can buy it from Amazon. It's available on Amazon. I just
let me see if I'll pull it up. You go ahead with it, and if I can't find it, we'll get it before
Acta
we get off.
Publications is the small publishing house that has supported me in this, and I want to support them.
Awesome.
If you buy 2 books, it doesn't have to be 2 copies of my book. Any 2 books, and your shipping is free. You can get a discount on buying multiple books. So just encourage you to use that small publisher. I just wanted to, in closing, share this poem that I used in the front of the book, which is not mine. Those words are by the Reverend Asher O'Callahan, who's a Lutheran pastor in Wisconsin and a trans man. And I adapted it with his permission a little bit for brevity in the front of the book, but I just think this is such a beautiful way of talking about the diversity of God's creation, and that we see everywhere, but also in gender identity. So this is called A New Creation Story for Trans and Non-Binary People, based on a poem by the Reverend Asher O'Callahan. In the beginning, God created day and night. But have you ever seen a sunset? Trans and non-binary people are kind of like sunsets, full of 100 shades of color you can't see in plain daylight or during the dark night. In the beginning, God created land and sea. But have you ever seen a beach? Trans and non-binary people are kind of like beaches, an oasis that's not quite the ocean, not quite like the land. In the beginning, God created birds of the air and fish of the sea. But have you ever seen a flying fish or a seagull or a puffin that swims and flies? Trans and non-binary people are kind of like those amazing creatures. We spend our time between the water and the land, creative combinations of characteristics that blows people's minds. In the beginning, God created male and female in God's own image. God created them. So in the same way, God created people with genders beyond male and female in God's own image. God created them. God created people cis, trans, non-binary, agender, and intersex, in between, outside of, and beyond night and day, land and sea, fish and bird. All different sorts of people, all different sorts of relationships. God created them from love, and to be loved. God created them all in God's own image, and God is still creating them.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rachel, for offering that. What a good benediction to our evening. Again, we just appreciate your time here this evening. And Rachel, thank you for hosting and being a part of the conversation and leading us. I did find the link, and so I put it in the chat, and just an invitation to check out Rachel's book. Know that we are here. We walk alongside you. We journey alongside you. If there's ways that Reconciling Ministries can partner with you or support you in your journey, know that you have a friend, and that we want to be a part of this journey with you. And again, we just thank you for being here this evening. We'll keep conversations going. This is ongoing learning that we're all doing. So thanks for doing it alongside us this evening. Take care. Go in peace.
Thanks,
Emily. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for the invitation to be here.
Absolutely.